thank you so much for joining us in this really important conversation. Is there a French new anti-Semitism? And of course, a hugely important, timely topic for today. And we're very excited to have Bruno with us. I'm Miriam Ellman. I'm the executive director of AEN. I'm delighted to welcome to this event our faculty members from across the country and also a number of faculty and other colleagues from the University of Minnesota and the Twin Cities who are joining us today. And before we begin, I'd really like to thank Oren Gross and Dan Gordon, who co-organized this spring webinar series for us. And this is the fourth seminar in a five-part series. You can view the other webinars on AEN's website. Oren Gross chairs our section for faculty in law, and Dan Gordon chairs our interest group for faculty in the Northeast. And so they collaborated to organize this five-part seminar series this spring while we're all virtual and online. Dan Gordon is professor of history at the University of Massachusetts and has published extensively on the French Enlightenment and on contemporary intellectual and legal history. And Oren Gross is the Irving Younger Professor of Law at the University of Minnesota Law School and an internationally recognized expert in areas of international law and national security law. So Dan and Oren, we in the AEN leadership team are truly grateful all your work to plan and organize this webinar series and for your ongoing commitment to AEN. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Oren. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you all that are joining us in person, and to the millions who are undoubtedly going to watch this at home. I want to take the opportunity to welcome you all to the fourth installment of this lecture series. And I invite those of you who are here or who are listening and who may be either professionally interested or geographically situated to contact either myself for faculty in law or Dan Gordon for those of you who are in the Northeast, and to join the respective AEN section. It is truly a pleasure today to introduce my dear friend and University of Minnesota colleague, Professor Bruno Chaouat. Bruno is a professor at the U, as we call it here in Minnesota, in the Department of French and Italian, which he also chaired, and also affiliate faculty at the Center for Jewish Studies. He has also served as the director and is affiliated with the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He's an honorary fellow at the Center for the Study of Jewish Culture, Society and Politics in Durham University in the United Kingdom. And not only is he a professor, he's also a knight. He's a Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques. So we have here not only an officer and a gentleman, but a professor and a knight. Bruno has published extensively on French literature, culture, and philosophy. And I guess most pertinent to the talk today is a book that he published in 2016 on French responses to the resurgence of anti-Semitism and the relations between postmodern thought and those responses. And those of you who are interested, I highly recommend Is Theory Good for the Jews? How can you not buy a book? Just this title alone merits purchasing it, French Thought and the Challenge of the New Anti-Semitism. Now, when I contacted Bruno several months ago and asked him to speak about the question of the existence and the nature of new anti-Semitism in its French garb, that was before the, to me, outrageous decision of the French courts in the Sarah Halimi case, and before the current terrorist attacks by Hamas and Israel's self-defensive acts have taken place. If anything, these events have made the topic of today's talk all the more topical. Now, before I turn the floor over to Bruno, two things that I want to mention. One is a word about today's procedures. Bruno will be speaking for about 20-25 minutes, and his talk will be followed up by Q&A. If you wish to ask a question, please write it down in the chat box. I will call on you and ask you to unmute and ask your question. And then finally, I wanted to bring to your attention a conference that two of our fellow members of the section for faculty in-law, Rob Katz, who is on the call, and Diane Klein. Is Diane on the call? Nope. Are putting together on the topic of legal responses to anti-Semitism. And for those of you interested in learning more, I will be putting Rob's and Diane's email in the chat box, and you can contact them directly. With that, Bruno, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Miriam and Oren, for the invitation. So, yeah, when I was thinking about what I was going to say, I thought that the group in the audience would be not that much versed in French affairs, but I see that there are friends here like Maury, who is somewhere hiding, and Richard and so on, who know French probably as much, if not better than I do. So what I'm going to say is probably going to be very redundant for some of you, and I hope a little bit less redundant for others. So I'm going to try to think loudly and not read anything right now. So the first thing I would like to say, something which all of you may know or not, is that France has the largest Jewish community in Europe, and also probably the largest Muslim community in Europe. I also want to add to that the attacks against Jews are much higher than the attacks against Muslims. And the attacks against Christians actually are also much higher than the attacks against Muslims, which I think is interesting. I just read that in a book just published a month ago or so by Mohamed Sifawi, who is a journalist, French journalist of North African descent, who makes this, who reminds us this intriguing statistics. So you probably are familiar with a little bit with the history of European and French anti-Semitism, and you would know that anti-Semitism used to be very much a problem on the right wing. We have Maury here, who is the Dreyfus Affair scholar. You all know about the Dreyfus Affair. You all know about the collaboration, but something you may know a little less is that there is a long tradition in the 19th century of counter-revolution and anti-republican, monarchist, and Catholic anti-Semitism. So this is one aspect that this whole trajectory, if you will, and this whole ideology of the counter-revolution leads directly to the Dreyfus Affair and to the anti-republicanism, and later on in the early 20th century, anti-Semitism, etc. And of course, the collaboration. There is also, of course, an anti-Semitism that comes from the left and which is older than we could think. It's not something that dates back like 20 years ago. This anti-Semitism has manifested itself with Holocaust denial or Holocaust relativization, and of course, anti-Zionism. One of the main book, maybe sort of a landmark, I would say, that I've read on this topic is Leon Poliakov, From Anti-Semitism to Anti-Zionism, or maybe the other way around, I forgot now. But it was published at the moment of the 1960s, that is during the Six-Day War, something like that. And Poliakov did a wonderful exploration of the left wing tendency towards anti-Semitism. Of course, we would have to again go back genealogically to the 19th century and to Marx, but also I'm thinking in France to Proudhon and the left-wing revolutionary left anti-Semitism. By the way, there is a great book that I think still needs to be translated into English by Danny Trom. I don't know if anyone is familiar, probably Richard is, I'm sure, maybe Maury. A great book by Danny Trom called The Promise and the Obstacle. And it's called The Jewish problem and what is it called again? The Jewish problem and the radical sociology or something like that. And it's very, very interesting because Danny Trom is actually showing that the left has had, in its DNA, there is a promise of emancipation, the promise of revolution. And he shows from a structural and philosophical perspective how the Jew, quote unquote, stands as a sort of obstacle to this promise of emancipation. It wouldn't be too difficult to understand how today Israel is this obstacle for most of the left, right? So, I mean, not most of the left, but maybe the revolutionary left, or the radical left. Okay, I would say that today the main problem in terms of attacks and violence against Jews and Jewish sites comes from Muslim immigration and its legacy. So the question is why. We could talk first of an importation of a certain Islamic view of the Jews, which can be found in the holy texts. So that's one thing, and perhaps there is this importation of Muslim antisemitism and anti-Judaism in France. But there is also this feeling that the Holocaust is being talked too much, and that the Holocaust is a European problem and has nothing to do with Africa, with North Africa. So this is something very palpable, especially for those who teach in high schools and maybe even beyond high school. It is notorious that teaching the Holocaust in France for at least 20 years has become very, very difficult. And one reason is the resistance from other minorities, especially from West Africa and from North Africa. So there is this kind of, resistance to be addressed, if you will, by this history, as though this history was not part of where we come from, i.e., Africa and colonization and so on and so forth. So that's, I think, is a very important aspect of the problem. Some talk about victim competition, and it's not untrue that there is a sense of wanting, and here I would need the help of a psychoanalyst to understand this phenomenon, this cultural phenomenon of the striving, I don't know if it's the word, for sort of victim recognition or victim status, which may be some more recent phenomenon in the culture than we think, or perhaps it is. I'm just throwing that, and I don't have an answer to that. So, of course, there is the burning issue of Israel and Palestine, which each time there is a conflict or a war in the Middle East, immediately you're going to have the repercussion in France. And of course, when I say in France, sometimes, I think Europe in general, right? Not let alone the US, where we know that those repercussions are also extremely tangible. There is one more element, which is the rise and the growth of radical Islam, or as they say in France, Islam politique, with Daesh, and before Daesh with other terrorist organizations. So Jews in France have been targeted since almost 20 years now, but very brutally since, I would say, 2012, with the Toulouse incident, tragedy. Jews, they've been targeted, and also, I would say, together with the symbols of the French Republic, since in 2012, some of you may recall, it was the Jewish children in the school yard, right, who were murdered, and also some French soldiers. So that's an interesting sort of sense in France that when the Jews are attacked, the Republic is also attacked and under assault. And that's also why the statements from French officials are generally extremely powerful and strong in support. They're regarding Israel, it's another question, but when it comes to supporting the French Jewish community, the statements are always extremely unambiguous and very powerful, I would say, because the French officials and the French media know that attacking the Jews is also attacking this minority that has been embracing, if you will, the French Republic for centuries, since at least the emancipation of the Jews in the 1790s. And I think they really sort of stand as a symbol of the, I don't like the word, but I think you understand, the sort of integration of a minority within the French Republic. So you mentioned, I think, Oren, the recent tragedy and legal outcome of Sarah Alimi, the murder of Sarah Alimi. You all know about this tragedy, I'm sure. This is the perpetrator is a Muslim from Mali, who, according to my sources and what we all have access to, had been recently radicalized. Now, I cannot enter into discussing the trial because I have absolutely zero competence in law, unlike Oren, and in French law or in any kind of law. You know that he was deemed a psychopath, but it was more complicated because there was apparently a trigger for this eruption of psychosis, and the trigger was cannabis, marijuana. So the huge debate in France for the last 2 months has been, is the French judiciary anti-Semitic? Is the French judiciary system anti-Semitic? My answer to that is no, I don't think so. I think that they have followed, probably thoughtlessly, expertise from psychiatrists. The psychiatrist expertises were not consensual, but they were in majority leaning toward exoneration. It's not the technical word, but explanation by the psychosis, okay. And that's the reason why he ends up now in a psychiatric institution. So the law in France is extremely complicated regarding responsibility when someone is deemed to suffer from psychosis. Now, we can discuss that later if you like. I tend to agree with Robert Badinter, the former Minister of Ministry of Justice, who is adamantly expressing that he does not believe in anti-Semitic bias from the French judiciary. And I think the explanation has to be found somewhere else. I talked about thoughtlessness, sort of blind following of expertise, which can be a problem in the law. Now there is in France also what we call here the woke or anti-racist movement or neo-anti-racist movement in France. And I would say that this movement in France has lots of commonalities with the US, with much stronger resistance than in the US, simply because France has a long tradition of secularism that we call laïcité, and which is not exactly secularism. It's a whole different concept altogether. It's very idiosyncratic. And so the French are very much reticent or reluctant to embrace ideologies that fragment the society, if I can put it this way. And the new anti-racism is very much an ideology of separation, of fragmentation, i.e. black, white, Muslims, and so on and so forth. And the French really dislike it very much. So there is a very strong resistance to this movement. It doesn't mean that this movement is not entering and penetrating the French university, because it actually is. And so there are some associations that try to, or French intellectuals that try to resist this wave that they see as an Americanization. I think it's Daniel, are you here? Trying to find out. Daniel, yeah, Daniel, you just mentioned, Daniel Gordon just mentioned this article from the New York Times where there was a mention of Macron talking about the Americanization of the French university. And I mean, personally, I think that there is a remnant of French anti-Americanism in this kind of rhetoric, but there is also some truth. So I would locate myself pretty much in the middle of this debate, because I do think that there is a strong influence of American campuses and American ideologies in France today. At the same time, I do think that some French intellectuals, mainly conservatives, are actually using it as in their resistance to Americanization. But that's very funny at the same time, because what you see now is the irony is that you see the left, or the radical left, or the campus left turning toward America, which used to be the other way around, right? So it used to be that everything that came from America was fascist and capitalist and so on. But now what you have is the left actually turning toward gender studies, toward critical race theory, toward you name it, all those new studies, right? And they find there's some kind of new narrative of emancipation, as though all the narrative of emancipation of the left had collapsed. And now what you have is this kind of fragmentation or fragmented studies that seem to be, LGBTQI and so on. And so that seem to actually be taking some hold in the French institution. So the Jews, due to, in the context of this anti-racist, you stop me whenever, by the way, Oren. All right, so the Jews are seen as, by this new anti-racist movement, as part of the white population. And I think there is the same situation in the US exactly. Actually, I've heard, but I have to be discreet, but I've heard that on some campuses, which I'm not going to name, there are some trainings, anti-bias trainings, where Black people are put in one virtual room and white people in another virtual room. And the Jews don't exactly know where they belong, but they are assigned the white room, okay? So that's very, very interesting. So, and in France, you have exactly the same type of configuration, especially with new ideologues, very influenced by American campus, such as Uriah Boutelja, for example, who wrote a book entitled Les Noirs, how is it in English? How will you say? The Blacks, the Jews, and us. No, the whites, I'm sorry. The whites, the Jews, and les Blancs, yeah, the whites, the Jews, and us. A title that would never have been conceivable 10 or 15 years ago. it is the absolute no-no from the perspective of French laicité. Okay, so the idea of writing a book and publishing a book entitled that would have been considered absolutely racist and anti-secular and and so on and so forth. But now it's something that can happen, in part due to this sort of woke indigenous movement. So the Jews don't have the status of persecuted people anymore, and it's the case since national sovereignty in Israel. So the radical left often uses Israel, as you know, because it's the same here as its target against what they call now settler colonialism. And the Jews were perceived as colonial and racist. But again, it's really not new at all. Again, it's not like in the past 10 or 20 years at all. It's something that goes back. I mean, I found actually traces of that as early as the 1940s, late 40s, with a philosopher like Emmanuel Levinas, who was denouncing actually this. I see chats, but I cannot read now. Who was denouncing this stigmatization of the Jews as colonialist and racist since the independence of Israel, maybe the 50s. I shouldn't say the 40s, but the 50s. You already have this observation, right, that the Jews are put on the side of. Then there was a book published 5 or maybe 8 years ago called the end of la fin de the end of the Jewish, I forgot the title, I apologize, but it's a philosopher from Cornell, a historian from Cornell named Enzo Traverso, who wrote a book in which he argues, and since the independence of Israel, the Jews are now part of the oppressive majority, if you will, and they have completely shifted. They are no longer the sort of diasporic revolutionary force, okay, but they are now a force of conservatism. All right, so there is another big question, the end of Jewish modernity. Thank you, Maury. So there is, well, I think I wrote about that. I already repressed it, I suppose. Okay, so another big question that agitates the French intelligentsia and media today is the question of Islamo-leftism, Islamo-gauchisme, as the French call it. Is there such a thing as Islamo-leftism, i.e. an alliance between radical Islam and the radical left? According to Mohammed Sifawi, whom I mentioned earlier, this alliance of odd, strange bedfellows is actually older than we think. It goes back to the anti-colonial wars, to Algeria, to the FLN, to Egypt in the 1950s, etc. There are lots of traces of this alliance in history. So it is not something that comes up from nowhere, that comes out of nowhere. It is actually a category, I think, and I agree with Sifawi on that. Oh yeah, okay, I'm almost done. Now, for those interested in this problem of the left, or the revolutionary left, with Islam and with religion in general, there is a wonderful book that needs to be translated into English that's called A Religious Silence by Jean Birnbaum from Le Monde, journalist at Le Monde. And Birnbaum makes a wonderful argument, very compelling, I think, that the left has been reluctant since the beginning, since the 19th century, of recognizing the importance of religion because it's superstructural and not infrastructural. And they always thought of religion as something that was going to phase out with the revolution. So they never took very seriously religion and of course, Islam in particular, okay? So Islam is not being taken seriously, so that the left think they can use the radical Islam to their ends, revolutionary, and the Islamists are very happy about it because they think that they can use actually the boost from the radical left to push their own agenda. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Bruno. I think that was very thought-provoking. There are a lot of also references that you mentioned, and I think that one thing that I already saw in the chat that will be really helpful is if I could ask you, not now, but maybe later, if you can send me some of those references, like Sifawi's book and others, and share them among everybody on the call. Let me start with moderator's prerogative. I'll call on Dan, and then I'll take the second question. Dan.
Thank you very much, Bruno. My question, which is in the chat, is if you could say something about philo-Semitism in France. Are there any demographic groups other than the Jews that are vectors of philo-Semitism, or to put it more mildly, anti-Semitism? I sometimes think the majority of Zionists in the United States are Christians. Because there's so many Christians, and there is, as you know, a subsection of Christians that are very pro-Israel. It may relate ultimately to Christian theology, but they're still pro-Israel and pro-Jewish. What about on the French side?
Yeah, it's a tough question. It's very touchy because, you know, the Jews now in Israel in particular are very much supported by the far right in France or by the conservative, the moderate, let's say the center right. It is, I was watching some debates, the French Assembly recently, and what you have is all the left side of the Assembly screaming against Israel and pro-Palestine, and the right conservative side supporting Israel. So that's actually an interesting, I don't think it's a shift. I think it's been like this for a while. Now, the question of philo-Semitism is a very, very difficult question historically, because you could go back in time and in sort of kind of post-Shoah philo-Semitism, right? And you would find some, the left being very philo-Semitic, but in the sense of liking the Jews as vulnerable, or liking the Jews as victims and as oppressed. And with a sort of cognitive dissonance of seeing the Jews becoming, quote unquote, the oppressor, or quote unquote, the ones with a sovereign state and so on, and oppressing the Palestinian, there is a cognitive dissonance for that sort of philo-Semitism, right? And what you have is actually a complete rejection of Israel, sort of the Israeli Jew, if you will, and the continuation of this sort of idealization of the Jew as diasporic and exiled and victimized, etc., etc. So that's, and also the Judaization of the Palestinian very often, right, in the rhetoric. So, but it's again something that is not completely new, far from it. So I would say, yeah, the sort of philo-Israelism, I would call it this way, is mainly coming from center-right and far-right as well, and probably lots of Catholics, but right-wing Catholics. That's about it. I don't know, maybe Maury, you have more to say, but someone has more to say, I'm sure. Richard, or people who know France better than I do. As I said, I don't go to France anymore.
So let me jump in, and yes, I do open and invite others, as Bruno suggested, if other people want to jump in. Actually, since we are relatively a small group, you can also use the kind of the raise hand blue signal, and I'll happily call on you. Bruno, I have two kind of, I guess, related questions. One is, I remember a survey that was done, or a poll that was done last year, and that showed that a majority of French Jews, those that have not moved to other countries, mainly to the United States and Israel, are basically hiding their Jewish identity. You know, anything from yarmulkes that are made to look like piece of hair, to removing mezuzahs from doors, and so on and so forth. And I also, if memory serves right, there was also a conversation about quite a large number of Jews saying that they are considering moving to different cities, different neighborhoods. So there's also a demographic element to this anti-Semitism. And I wonder, where do you see French Judaism going in light of the trends that you identified? And the second question then asks about philo-Semitism. I guess I will take it maybe one level up and ask you to what extent is the question of anti-Semitism, because it's coming from the far right and the far left and the Islamists, to what extent do French politicians, do French, or maybe even the French people, start thinking about anti-Semitism not as a Jewish problem, but rather as a French problem, as a problem that actually threatens France as such?
Yeah, well, there are the intellectuals who are and the politicians, again, who are thinking of anti-Semitism in terms of a threat for the French Republic, I would say, are generally centrist or even center-right. I'm thinking of conservative, even Christian philosophers like Pierre Manant, for example. There are figures like that who are very much aware that what is going on, and of course I could name our friend Pascal Bruckner as well, who has seen very, very clearly for a very long time now that the threat against the Jews in France, the threat against the French Republic, and many others have seen that. I am absolutely sure that politicians like Manuel Valls and other figures, and even Macron, I'm pretty sure actually, are seeing the threat, especially when you have like attacks against, Charlie Hebdo, and then the Hypercacher, at the same time, or so it's sort of coordinated attacks like this. You realize that it's not a Jewish problem. You realize that it's actually a problem in French society that has to do with, we thought 20 years ago, we said importation of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but we know better now that it's something else, right? That it has to do with Daesh, it has to do with Salafi Islam, and so on and so forth. So I'd say, yeah, I don't know if it answers your question, but as far as the demographics is concerned, I don't know that much. All I know is that you're right, that visible Judaism, a Jew who is visible is in trouble in France. I don't really think that the French Jews would really advertise their Jewish identity, and especially not in many territories, many suburbs, and so on and so forth in France. So living hidden. Are they living? So I don't know. There is a certain immigration to Israel, but it's a very small one. Actually, it's not that big. And for other immigration towards the other countries, I'm not familiar. I don't really know. Richard, you wanted to?
Yeah.
Hello, Richard.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to say something about the Alimi affair, because it seems to me that the anti-Semitism comes from two sides, if you will. One is the fear of Muslims. And it seems to me that, certainly the judge in the Alimi affair went out of her way, A, to deny that there was any anti-Semitism involved, and B, to keep going to psychiatrists until she could get somebody who would say, okay, he can't stand trial. Mm-hmm. So that in that sense, it seems to me we're also dealing with a kind of fear of Muslims and radical Muslims. On the subject of philo-Judaism, one of the things that struck me was that in the 90s, there really was a sort of intellectual philo-Judaism, which vanished with Muhammad ad-Dura and the outbreak of the Second Intifada, in which all of a sudden, Nidra Polar has written extensively about this, all of a sudden you could cut the hostility to Jews with a knife. It was like, finally, we can say what we wanted to say all along, but couldn't. And that cuts deep into, it's not just the extremes. The way I put it was the French were sipping their anti-Semitic wine while they held an open bar for the most ferocious anti-Semitism amongst their Muslims.
Yeah. So I disagree with you, but again, it's about the exoneration from anti-Semitism, because what actually struck everybody in the trial, in the verdict, was that actually they did retain anti-Semitism, which is very strange, because in a way you could say, well, if it's anti-Semitic, then there is a responsibility. Obviously, you can judge the person. Why is it that you don't judge someone if you admit that there is a motivation that is anti-Semitic? So it's even more tricky than that, because there was the aspect of anti-Semitism is very clearly retained, do you say in English? Kept, or mentioned by the court. So and when it comes to the other aspect of what you were saying, it's true that the Second Intifada has been a trigger for unleashing, if you will, some very violent anti-Semitism, and also tropes such as Jews are the new Nazis and so on, that really came up at that time, early 2000s, I would think. And you had some great thinkers, otherwise great thinkers like Edgar Morin, for example, who could write, that sort of things, that the Sahal is now the new Nazi. So all those inversions came up at that moment. And you're right to say that there is a collective psychological element which has to do with a sort of return of the repressed, or whatever you want to call that. But I agree with you on that. That's been a triggering moment in the history of post-Shoah, if you will, and the French. And the Jews,
Yeah, and there's an irony in that, because here's the French who, around the Adour affair and all of this sort of vicious anti-Zionism in the early 2000s, exporting their critical theory to the Americans, who appropriate it, and then it gets re-exported back, and all of a sudden the French are presenting themselves as the defenders of democracy against these crazy American theories, which were actually originally taken from the French.
Well, on this, there is an interesting book which is problematic in many aspects, because it's very reductive, but it's still good and it's still useful. And it's a James Lindsay book, and it's Helen Pluckrow's book called how is it? Cynical Theories. You've read it probably.
Oh yeah, no, yes, I haven't
read it. It's very funny. I mean, it's it's a commercial book, but it's still very interesting when it comes to the way that they talk about applied postmodernism. And once postmodernism, whatever that is applied, you get critical race theory and disability studies and all those. But I disagree in a way, but there are some good points that they are making. They are interesting. It's an interesting genealogy that has lots of flaws, but it's still very interesting to read.
I have it in Kindle.
And I guess I will add to this, again, just using the moderator prerogative, the question, since we started in a sense with the French version, so to speak, or the new French version of anti-Semitism, because I think an old version existed. So we're talking really about the new version. To what extent, to what extent can we talk about a French version or a French subcategory of anti-Semitism, and how is that different? And I'm throwing this maybe to the crowd in general, but also to you, Bruno, from a more generic, I would call it, European anti-Semitism. Is the fact that France has the largest Muslim community, and I'm thinking of also of countries like Germany. Right? To what extent is the flavor, so to speak, of anti-Semitism in those countries, especially coming from the left, different than the flavor of anti-Semitism coming from other countries in Europe, say Italy, say Spain, or others, where the Muslim community is smaller? Can we identify here a new subcategory of new anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it's hard to respond, but I would say that there are like two aspects of the French recent history which is so fraught. One with colonialism, and second with anti-Semitism and collaboration in particular. So if you have those two things together, and you can create a sort of some very strange, very abstract theoretical equations, such as okay, so Palestinians are colonized, so we used to be colonizer, so perhaps the Jews are now colonizers, so therefore they are what we used to be. You know, all those bizarre psychological, I don't even know if it's the word that is correct here, but all those strange scenarios of the imaginary, so to speak, of the national imaginary, are playing into this specificity of the Frenchness, if you will, of the anti-Semitism that makes it sort of different from what you have in England, which has its own brand of, you know, an old anti-Semitism and so on. And yes, the guilt vis-a-vis the former colonized is very, very strong. Especially because those colonized are not just the North Africans, but they are also from West Africa. So there is also the race issue, which is very important. And so how do you deal with that? We have those Black people we used to colonize them and treat them like subhuman, and they are expressing anti-Semitism, but are they really responsible for that? So it may actually explain a lot also about the verdict of the court, you know, because he was Black from Mali, and so is he really responsible if he's you know, all those things are so intricate, you know, hard to disentangle. But I would say that, yeah, there is a specificity. I see a hand.
So hold on, let me just do this. I want to call on Maurice because I can see that he has something connected. Jacob's question kind of directly relates to that. So maybe more than Jacob. Richard, if you have something to complement then, and then Stephen Gertzov had also a question that
Maury has
Maury, go ahead.
Just a small point, and first of all, thank you, Bruno, for, you know, always fascinating. I was just going to say the other thing that I think makes for the specificity of the French case is that they have many more Jews than any place else in Europe. You know, exactly. So it's a place where, you know, it has the largest population of Muslims and Jews. In certain parts of France, they live in close proximity, but there's also this sense, I think, there that the Jews are this ethnic group that has succeeded overwhelmingly. They're occupying, you know, very high positions of, they're perceived as occupying very high positions in government and the media. And I think that you know, versus their virtual Jews in most of the rest of
That's
Europe.
True. Thank you, Maury. That's absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah, the demographic is very, very important element here.
So before I come back to Richard, Jacob, do you want to ask your question? Because I think it's somewhat related to this discussion.
Well, I was really wondering about whether this sort of alliance of the I guess Islamists and the left is a function of the demographic size of the Muslim population in France versus the sort of strange particularities in which it's kind of difficult to integrate into French society as an immigrant from North Africa or the Middle East. I spent a number of years living in France and sort of witnessed it firsthand. And so is it size, or is it that sort of struggle to become French? Thank you.
It's the big question of France, right? The big question of France is it the problem that France does not integrate because they want assimilation, they want integration? Do they want, you know, their immigrants? First of all, they are not really immigrants we're talking about, right? They are second, third, whatever generation of people who came a while ago to work in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and etc. So several waves of immigration. I would say that France has a tragic tie with Algeria, first of all, due to history, and there is an entangled histories between France and Algeria. And you probably are aware that in the 1990s, there were some serious tension during the Algerian civil war and repercussions of that in France. So what you have had in France is a rise of a sort of culture of Islamism and radicalization that is probably much superior to some other countries of Europe. I am not sure, frankly, that it's possible to say that it's because of the French rejection or rejectionism of, you know, of immigrants or different people. Because, and I'm contradicting myself now, so just accuse me of that, because in England you also have a very different fabric, social and cultural fabric of integration, what they call the multicultural, or what they used to call that anyway, and also in Germany to an extent, but differently. And there is also a very serious rise of you know, attacks and terrorism and radical Islam and so on. So is it really a French? So I can hear someone.
It's me.
All
Sorry.
right, sorry. So is it really a French problem? I am not sure. I mean, it's dialectical. So it's always dialectical. So you cannot never say it's just because those Arabs who are doing those things because they are mean people. No, it's a two-way thing. It's obvious. But I do think that the rise of radical Islam is a very, very important component of that. I mean, I grew up in France in the 1970s, 80s, and all those things did not exist, whereas I tell you, laïcité existed very much. The model of the Third Republic, assimilation, existed very much when I grew up there. But we had zero issue of what the French call now separatism or secessionism, right? It did not exist. So something happened. Maybe it's demographic, maybe it's the rise of radical Islam, maybe it's the fact that the French model is no longer seen as a sort of an ideal, if you will, that people aspire to embrace, right? Or the French Republic can no longer make people dream, or the French school is no longer something you want to belong to. So there are lots of different crises there that may explain this situation.
I don't know if Algeria became French or was part of France as it was claimed, but it seems from the talk that maybe France has become more Algerian. Richard, you had a comment.
Unmute. Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to point out the irony of the Europeans, the French in the lead, but I think it's a pretty pan-European phenomenon of sort of assuaging their guilt for colonialism by using it to wipe out their guilt for 2,000 years of crapping on Jews. So, you know, I'm suspicious of this notion that somehow they're assuaging their guilt. And in particular, you know, they are assuaging their guilt by appeasing people who hate them. And here are the Jews who want nothing more than to love the democracies that they live in, getting crapped on. So that brings me to the second point I wanted to make, which is to what extent do you think that there's a possibility that this Islamo-Gauchiste alliance is similar to what some people have pointed out in England about the alliance between the Church of England and the Islamists, and that is that they both have a kind of supersessionist hostility to the Jews, that the left is now considers itself the sort of, you know, global moral force, and therefore they don't consider Islam to be a moral force that threatens them, but the Jews do.
That's interesting. I don't really know about the Church of England, frankly. I mean, we all know about Jeremy Corbyn, about the left in England. This is more what I had in mind in terms of analogy, if you will, but I don't really know how it plays out with the Church of England. But when it comes to supersessionism, it's always a narrative which has been extremely important at the unconscious collective of Europe. I mean, that's just a fact, right? So the idea that the revolution was, in a way, the sort of replacement theology for the replacement theology of Christianity is quite clear to me. And that the Jews are still the problem in this theology of replacement. I agree on that. I think there is something to explore at the very roots of the European or Judeo-Christian, as they call it, psyche. I agree. I think that there is something like that, absolutely. And then again, there is Islam. Remember, is also being perceived as more universalist than Jewish identity, which is seen as more particularist, right? And so maybe there can be a sort of alliance between forms of self-perceived universalisms, such as the revolution, and Islam that wants to liberate everybody from poverty and so on. So you know. Yeah, so I would agree with you.
Yeah. So again, the irony of, you know, accusing Israel of being imperialist, when in fact the universalism is a form of religious imperialism, especially in its Muslim form. So here they are embracing, you know, and we had this in America with Judith Butler saying that, you know, Hamas and Hezbollah are members of the anti-imperialist global progressive left.
Yeah, there is an interesting book I read recently by this Israeli historian. I forgot his name now, but it's about the praise of nationalism. It's kind of a weird.
Oh yeah, Hazoni.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you know, it's very thank you, Oren. Yeah, it's very counterintuitive, right? How can you praise nationalism? It's terrible. But in a way, you know, if you think about it, I was listening to a program on France Culture this morning about Carl Schmitt, and if you think about it, Carl Schmitt was there is a form of nationalism which is extremely imperialistic, and there is a form of nationalism which actually contains imperialism, and his argument, Azonia's argument, is that Israel actually contains imperialism, which I think is an interest. I don't know if it's true, but it's a very interesting argument, very counterintuitive.
On the subject of books like that, I recommend Rabbi Sachs, The Dignity of Difference.
Yep. We have literally like a couple of minutes. Steve, did you have a quick question, and then Bruno, a quick answer?
My question was about the effect of Jules Isaac's book. He was a French historian. He deconstructed their anti-Semitism for them, led to the Nostra Aetate. Did that have any impact on French society, laïcité as a whole?
Can you see my finger pointing to you, Maury? I have no idea.
I would just say, actually, there's a great new book by the Princeton historian Phil Nord called After the Deportation, where he discusses that. He has a whole chapter on that. So I point you towards that.
You saved my life.
Excellent. Miriam, I know that you have to go. Do you have any closing remarks before we wrap it all up?
Well, I just want to say, Bruno, you really energize this group, and it's wonderful to see so many of our AEN members with the expertise to engage with the speaker. And hugely important. I'm just thinking about everything you've said, and campuses in the US, campuses in France,
Mhm.
and the issues of anti-Semitism when it bubbles up in minorities, which is becoming, a real problem on American campuses. And I'm seeing, you're saying these issues are have long been a problem in France for various reasons. So whether it's colonialism and slavery in the US, and just people have a real problem dealing with anti-Semitism from minority communities. So I've taken a ton of notes. I know many have. We'll be in touch. Remember, everybody, that on June 3rd is the last seminar of Dan and Oren's seminar series. I got to head out to another meeting, but I think we can stay on a little bit. Oren and Bruno, if that works for you,
I
and
think,
Dan.
Miriam, we are pausing the recording if there are people who want to stay for a few minutes. If Bruno has the time to schmooze, that's great. I mean, what's a webinar without schmoozing? But if not, let me just take the opportunity to thank Bruno on behalf of everybody.
Thank you so
Again,
much,
those who want to
guys.
stay for a few minutes, great. But if not, thank you all.
I appreciate your attendance. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.